It's about 20 minutes after the hour of 7 o'clock. Welcome back to the Now Morning Show. Now, World Autism Awareness Day is commemorated on April 2nd. But throughout the month, many organizations focus on sharing stories and providing opportunities to increase understanding and acceptance of people with autism, all while fostering worldwide support. And so this morning, we're joined by special education educator and educational technologist, Ms. Gaynell Ramkisoon, to share more with us about autism and special education. Good morning, Mrs. Ramkisoon.
Good morning.
How are you this morning?
I'm wonderful, thank you.
We're going to start off the conversation with autism, just to give us an overview of what exactly is autism.
All right, well, autism is basically a neurological and developmental disorder, and it could affect children and even adults in 3 different ways. It can affect the way their interaction takes place with the world around them and with their peers and with even their own parents and so on. It could also be seen by very, very repetitive behaviors or restricted interests. So they may not be, as a regular neurotypical child, interested in all the things that excite other children and fascinate other children. They are very, very limited in their interests and so on. And it also affects every other part of their lifestyle. So the same behaviors would be seen at school, at church, at home, wherever they go. It's not something that you see only if they're in school or around a certain person or in a certain environment. It would be constant, affecting their entire life in every setting.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned it affects children and adults. So are you saying that at an adult age, maybe teenager to adult, you can get tested and maybe be deemed as someone who has autism?
Actually, you can. It's a little more difficult to diagnose in the later stages of life, but it is very possible. And the fact is, the CDC said 1 in 44 persons are diagnosed with autism. And many persons aren't even aware that they may have autism spectrum disorder, having one of the many, I wouldn't say diseases, but one of the many issues across the spectrum even today.
So then how do you, how can you identify the symptoms of it? And let's take it from the symptoms in a child versus an adult.
Sure. Well, it's very easy for parents to identify these symptoms. So usually the first set of persons to recognize these symptoms are parents, because you would be the one spending the most time with the child. So you'd observe that your baby isn't maintaining or sustaining eye contact. The child doesn't respond easily to having his name called or to people smile at them. You know, babies would usually smile back at you if you try to smile with them and so on. As the child gets older, they may not be attaining developmental milestones at the age that they're supposed to. So at the age when they would usually begin to babble and form simple sentences, the child is still quite quiet, not interested in communicating or anything like that. They may be very, very cranky and fussy and crying a lot because they can't express themselves, or they may be overstimulated and just don't know what to do about it. You would also recognize that as the child gets to the stage where they begin to interact with other children their age, they may prefer to stay by themselves, and they would not be willing to share and to converse, or they may not make friends easily and things like that. And then it also comes with things like hyperactivity. You may even have medical issues, hearing infections and constipation, and it's a wide range of things. But you'd initially look for that lack of communication, or the child being very uncomfortable in social settings and not attaining the developmental markers or milestones that children, neurotypical children, would usually attain.
And in adults?
Well, in adults, you'd usually find it as persons who would prefer to stay by themselves. We would call them introverts, but it may be taken to an extreme. And you would also find those persons preferring to not converse with you very much, again, not sustaining the eye contact and so on, or adults who have very particular interests or maybe very, very strange or queer, weird, right? So it can manifest like that in adults, but it's very, very tricky in adults. It's something, it's it's best identified in the earlier stages of life. That's why it's called a developmental disorder, because it's easier to track and easier to diagnose during the developmental stage of life.
Yeah. And so is it that the only way to know if someone is autistic is if they go to be diagnosed? Because I don't want people to feel, well, I'm an introvert, I don't like talking to people, I prefer to be by myself, and them thinking that they're autistic or somebody close to them calling them autistic, rather than they go to like a professional to give them that diagnosis.
That's right. We usually advise parents from the time you see these things, you would know it as a parent, especially if you would have had children before who were able to develop neurotypically and they were on key with all their milestones. You'll be able to see it. I am a parent of a child who has autism spectrum disorder. He's 8 years old now, but from very early on, I was able to observe the differences in his development. And when you go to your health center, visit your child wellness checkups, you let the doctors know, let the nurses know what you are seeing, or what you're not seeing for that matter, the differences as you observe them interact and so on. And usually they would put things in place to continue to closely monitor that child as they develop. Some of the symptoms might be quite glaring. And when it's like that, then it's easier to refer the child to the child developmental clinics and so on, where they would meet with the developmental pediatricians and all of those specialists who are able to actually diagnose early on, right? So we have to be careful not to just confuse those children who may develop a little slower, but they may not be
autistic
within the autism spectrum, and those who are actually displaying the signs of autism spectrum disorder.
Now, you mentioned the autism spectrum disorder. What is that spectrum that everybody refers to from time to time?
Basically, this spectrum is just a number of similar symptoms or similar disabilities that all fall under the neurological and developmental disorder category. It doesn't, some people think it refers to a range, so you could be high autistic and low autistic, but actually it just encompasses a range of similar neurological and developmental disorders that have very, very similar characteristics, but they are still quite different from each other.
Yeah, I've often heard people say that people with autism are almost close to genius level, where because they focus on certain things, it's almost as if they develop a certain sort of interest or certain IQ towards certain things. Is that correct? Is that true?
Actually, I like to refer to it as a superpowers. And strange enough, I'm glad to hear that that's your understanding, because many persons seem to think that persons who are diagnosed with autism are usually slow learners or so on, when in truth and in fact, most of them are very high functioning. They excel in science and math and music and art and so they do have their strong points while they have their weak points. So for example, my son is an A student. His memory is amazing. Nobody could tell you more about animals and space and science and so on, but he doesn't like to write and he doesn't like to read. So that accommodations and adaptations would have had to be made for him in school, where the focus is not so much on him sitting and finishing, copy all this stuff on the board and so on, because even though he may appear to not be paying attention, as with many persons on the spectrum, if you ask them anything along the lines of their interest level, they would blow you away with how much they know. So usually a lot of them are very high functioning and they are gifted in many, many areas.
Yeah. I mean, you have a son, is it, who is on the spectrum.
Yes.
What sort of advice would you give to parents who also have autistic children?
Okay. The one thing that I would say is early intervention. I've been an educator for the past 23 years, and I have been able to see firsthand the benefit of those parents who identified early and were able to have that sort of intervention put in place for their children. We would have come from the era where persons would have isolated and would have almost hidden children with any type of special education need, which would have actually retarded their progress and retarded their development. When in truth and in fact, the earlier you identify the symptoms, the earlier you have diagnosis being made, you can put things in place to help that child be able to cope and to adjust, to put the mechanisms and the systems in place. I'm also an SCA level teacher, And we have been able to see the benefit of children who came into first year unable to follow instructions, engaging in what we call echolalia, where they just repeat or parrot what you see and they aren't able to do anything. And then these children, because of the interventions we have put in place and the accommodations, they were able to write SCA and pass for schools and go on to lead successful lives because of early intervention.
So there are things in place in the public education system to help children who have special needs?
While there may not be as much as we would like there to be, there are systems in place. Student support is available. Once a child has a diagnosis and referral is made to student support, they try their best to accommodate those students with a student aide who stays with them for a period of time to ensure that they are able to learn as best as they can, that the accommodations are put in place. When it's time for SEA, concessions can be provided for them that allows them to have extra time, or if there are those who are affected by attention deficit disorders, they are able to work in rooms separate from everybody to avoid the distractions and so on. You have the special education teachers who try their best to come in from time to time to be able to ensure that those students are on track. So while it's not as much as we would like it to, there are some things put in place, but we really, really have a deficit with regards to how much support is available on the end of the Ministry of Education to help students with autism and other special education needs.
What more do you think is needed?
We could begin with more staffing for the students, more aides that stay in schools for the duration of their primary school years, because the aides usually stay for about 2 to 3 years, and then their contract is over, and then the child is left on their own. So we need to have more special education teachers. When I worked at student support, we would make a very, very concerted effort, but we have so many schools to visit, so you don't get to spend as much time as you would like to because of the need. So staffing, once more staffing is available, staffing that stays with the child throughout their years in the primary school, we'd be able to make a more meaningful impact in these students' lives.
And before you go, what is one thing you wish the public would know about students with autism, or for those who are on the spectrum? One thing you want us to know and take away from this conversation?
That they are people too. They are people just like you and me. They have feelings. Do not look at them and underestimate them. Do not judge them without getting to know them. I'd also encourage persons to educate yourself. Education is in the palm of your hand on your phone. Educate yourself so you would know the type of things that you would need to be aware of when dealing with persons with autism spectrum disorder. We're a society who likes to hug and like to touch and so, and not at all times these individuals are susceptible to that or would prefer that. And then when they do not engage as they like, many of us are ready to cast judgment on them. We might call them weird, or you might even identify them in the schools, classrooms and so on as that child can't sit and pay attention. I once, when we go to church, I would take my child's tablet with him because by a certain time his attention span is gone. And somebody in church was like, you need to teach him to sit and listen to the sermon. This is a 3-hour service. So things like that. Just educate yourself on the symptoms and so on, so that when you see persons, you see children displaying these behaviors, you'd come from an educated perspective and you'd respect them and you'd respect who they are and just allow them to be with the support and the love and the respect that they deserve.
Mrs. Ramkisulami, thank you so much for coming in this morning. I hope that we take away something from the conversation that we're having. And of course, thank you so much for the information that you shared.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
And that was special education educator and educational technologist, Mrs. Gaynell Ramkisoon, just sharing some information about autism and what we can look out for if we suspect that somebody is on the autism spectrum disorder. You're on the Now Morning Show. We're going to take a break and be right back. Stay with us.